Mr. Speaker, last year, on returning from the European Debating Championships 2011, I went to go to the shop on Tottenham High Road to buy some feta cheese. Now, I was actually unable to buy feta cheese because Tottenham High Road had been burnt down by rioters. We say to you this is an intolerable situation, one which can't happen again, and one which we aim to prevent with this policy. This House would block the use of Twitter during times of riots. So, what are we going to do? We don't think we ought to spend too much time talking to you about how technically we can accomplish this. We think we can just block it at the mobile phone level. It's technically possible. We'll just do that, right? So, I'm going to talk to you about why we value free speech in a society, what it is that free speech gives us, and why that doesn't apply in these circumstances. I'm also going to give you a comparative case, right? So, what's the alternative to this mechanism, the only useful alternative? And I'm also going to talk to you about signalling and why signalling is such a massive problem in riots and why this helps us avoid it. So, why is free speech useful? We say it's broadly useful because it lets us disseminate information, it lets us share ideas, it lets us share ways to build things, it lets us plan together and strategize. It lets us feel part of a wider society when we know that there are other people communicating with us, other people that share those ideas. It lets us share our emotions with other people, it lets us build things together. Now, the thing about all these things is they're only useful in as far as they're done in order to promote other good things, right? So at the point at which you're using free speech to coordinate things that are bad, for example, riots, then we think that free speech no longer becomes or no longer remains a good thing. And it's under these circumstances that we're happy to block it, right? So riots harm people, no thanks. Why do riots harm people? They harm people because lawless societies are societies in which one can't plan your life. A society which doesn't have the civilized use of the state is one in which you're not able to make decisions like investment and education and bettering your life because you don't know that tomorrow you won't be beaten up by a gang of people to steal your meat. No thank you. So we think that the ability to predict our lives tomorrow is really free speech. The utility of free speech is somewhat contingent upon that. We're only able to build the good things that free speech lets us build if we have this ability to make some predictions about the long term, right?
Okay.
And we think that, no thanks, if you undermine the state's ability to do that, then you undermine the entire civilized model, and we think this classifies as a bad outcome, right? So this bad outcome we're happy to avoid. And we're sure that we're not going to claim that this is going to effectively deal with the problem in all cases, right? What we say is it's going to make the problem much easier to deal with by the police. We'll give you some detail on why that is. And also we said that the model is better than the status quo. So we're giving you the comparative there. But let's give you another comparative, right? Go.
Is your contention that there is no situation in which a riot is legitimate?
As a Western liberal democracy, yeah, there's no situation in which a riot is better than writing letters to the editor, voting for a different political candidate, etc. We said that all examples of riots in the UK, like the Brixton riots, the Broadwater Farm riots, and the London riots last year, these have all been bad riots because the government here is broadly on the side of the good. So, the comparative. So we think that there's really two things we can do in times of riot, right? So either we do something like this and we stop the riot at the organisational level, or we take it to the streets. And we think that taking the riot policing to the street, which is what we've done in most circumstances in the UK, is hugely problematic, creates lots of harms. The first harm is that people get hurt, right? So water cannons, rubber bullets, and police truncheons all hurt people. These are casualties that we have to deal with. People don't like being hurt. Secondly, we think that rioters are somewhat incensed, right? Because it's when you see the line of police with the riot shields that you get the emotional charge, us versus the state toppling the status quo. That's the point at which the rioters are more incensed to do more rioty things. That's not what we want. Thirdly, you cut off access to large parts of the city for people to visit their relatives or to get emergency services access, stuff like that. Also a bad thing. Fourthly, you gain more media attention, right? Because what the cameras want to see, the TV cameras, is they want to see the line of police with the riot shields hitting people with truncheons. And at the point at which people see the riots on TV, that's when people go down there to see it. That's when the crowds start to swell. That's when it becomes really difficult to police. And it grows rapidly. And we know that in the past, the riots last year in London, the problem has been the police were unable to contain the riot as it started, right? It's when it reaches the point of critical mass that it becomes dangerous. This is what we want to avoid with this policy. We think that policing on the streets, when it's come to riots, has been hugely harmful. If we're able to stop it before we hit critical mass, then we almost certainly should do so. We also have a problem of signalling here. So we think that one escalation becomes multiple escalators. Because so there's a threshold in what you're willing to do. So if you're not willing to go into Greggs and steal the sausage rolls, right, then that's that's your boundary in the riot. But when you hear on Twitter that some other part of the city has started staking the sausage rolls, or even like the steak slices from Greg's, then at that point you're willing to do it too, because you know that that boundary has been crossed. It's no longer a massive push to cross the boundary. So we think that because we're having a comparative here between policing on the streets and between policing the organisation of the riots, because free speech is only useful in contextually limited circumstances, and also because signalling creates huge problems in the wider community, that this is a policy we have to implement. Mr. Speaker, we're proud to oppose. Propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, first off, I'd like to deal with a couple of contentions that I found from TJ's speech, because I think we need to really boil this debate down to the short and long-term effects of censoring Twitter during the times of riots and the aftermath of riots, and even prior to riots. And I think that those short and long terms are where opposition have already won this debate, because I don't think that the proposition have really properly considered the ramifications of what will occur through this motion. So let's talk about, first of all, the efficacy of this motion. Because if we are going to assert, or rather if the proposition is going to assert, that censoring Twitter allows for less signalling, or allows for less mobilisation of criminals, or allows for less people to know about areas where criminality is occurring, then they believe that it means that there will be less crime in general during riots or during these times of extreme violence or extreme social dissonance. But we don't believe that that's the case, because if we are banning things like Twitter, that means that we're assuming that the rest of the social media platform can't catch up. It means that we're assuming that there aren't going to be other offshoots of social media websites that are going to crop up and that are going to allow for these people to still engage in this criminal behaviour. Also, it means that that people lose the ability to mobilise on genuine public issues. So in response to the fact that these riots are occurring, let's look at the London riots that occurred earlier this year. After the riots, there were active groups that decided to mobilise to clean up the streets, that decided to mobilise to try and tackle the things that were happening in the city. And we don't believe that this would have been possible if we're censoring things like Twitter from even talking about these issues, because we believe that if you are blocking any sort of incendiary language from being used, or any sort of incendiary points from being raised, then it means that in essence, you're disallowing yourself effective means of catching people, which brings me on to the long-term effects. Go on.
Well, we're not just blocking some language on Twitter. We're quite happy to completely block Twitter at points when it's being used to mobilise for riots. We think that's the most effective way to do this.
Okay. Now, a way to deal with that is to ask, is the government always rightly placed to gauge the legitimacy of a riot? Are they always going to act in a position that means that they're not simply considering their personal political career, how they're going to be affected? We don't necessarily believe that this is the case. And we believe that sometimes positive things come from protests, sometimes positive things come from riots, especially in the media attention that they receive, because it means that issues that were previously left by the wayside, the issues that weren't previously being discussed, come to the fore of public consciousness. And we believe that it's really important, because it means that people are engaging in critical debate about what is actually going on. And thank you. Now, let's also talk about the really basic wider ramifications of this. Because if we're censoring a social media platform like Twitter or something like that, it means that we're inhibiting our ability to find and locate these criminals at the point of them trying to rally people to do something wrong. Because, under the government system and what they're proposing, if you had a lady that decided to tweet about her wish to get a couple of free pounds from Mothercare, and she was inciting many possible baby daddies to go and nick her a couple of pranks, right? We think that it would be a lot easier under the status quo to find and locate the people that were engaged in this sort of criminal behaviour than it would be afterwards to look through the CCTV footage and try and pinpoint the blurry images and try and catch people. We just believe that we're making a situation a lot more difficult when we already have means in which to try and tackle them. Now, even if you're not buying this, right, let's talk about situations where protests and riots could have had some legitimate cause, right? Let's talk about the student protests. Student protests and the student actions that happened earlier this year. Right, now we in this country have a voting process that is very exclusionary to young people, and we think that this is problematic because it means that there's no way in which they can express their discontent with the government, not through, as Tito said, voting for a different party or joining a party or trying to find some sort of political group that they feel best represents them. Rather, we believe that through the student protests and the student riots, they were able to express the sort of they were able to express disapproval with what the government was doing, and they were able to express the fact that they were unhappy. Yes, there was some violence. Yes, there were some problems. But we don't necessarily believe that that takes away from the message that was coming across, especially because it meant that there was broader public consciousness that was focused on an issue that was very important. Right. So because we believe that this motion would make it a lot more difficult to target the perpetrators of crime, because we believe that there are some legitimate causes of riots and legitimate forms of protest, and because we believe that in terms of efficacy, the prop have just generally got it wrong, we beg you to vote for the opposition. Thanks.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen. In this debate, we on the side of government are seeking to balance the rights of law-abiding citizens, their protection from crime, their protection from civil unrest, with the rights of other citizens to express themselves and their purported right to use social media to this end. I'm going to talk more about the climate of fear created when people can discuss these things in the way that happens and can coordinate and conspire to commit crimes openly. Right. I'm also going to talk more about the two worlds that exist, one in which this policy is adopted and one in which it isn't. First, I have a number of things I need to talk about from the previous speech. So, firstly, we do not believe that there are any legitimate aspects to rioting, right? The point at which something becomes a riot, so it's when it moves from being a peaceful protest to being a violent protest, when people are attacking the police or other people, when they are looting shops, when they are stealing things, or engaging in that sort of unrest, it is no longer legitimate, and we don't think anything can justify attacks on shops, on innocent individuals, and on the police. Right? So we just don't think there is any legitimacy to it. Insofar as there was, note that we are not banning media. We do not ban newspapers from covering these things. We do not ban television or radio news from covering these things. So people will still find out about it. What we are doing is removing an ability for people to discuss this themselves, right? So this is about stopping Dappy from N-dubs tweeting LOL and a picture of a burning riot police van, right? Versus the right of the people who own carpet right to not have their shops set on fire and looted, right? This isn't about stopping media from reporting. No. Right. Secondly, she talks about positive use. So we accept, like, when you shut down Twitter, there will be some positive uses, right? We think mostly when people are doing things like cleaning up at the riots, they need to wait until after the riots had happened, because you can't clean up a street when people are rioting in it, right? And even if you wanted to, we're happy to have some small positive actions be removed in pursuit of removing vastly more important harms, right? The real situation of people being attacked, the real situation of people being too afraid to leave their homes. Right. Finally, she says, well, this helps us identify those people. Well, yes, that's true. We accept that you are able to identify and prosecute some people for conspiracy to commit crimes. But we would rather those people not have committed that crime. When you don't give people an opportunity to conspire to commit crimes, most people will not, right? And it's certainly terrible for those individuals when they get sent to prison, right? We would just rather they not be allowed to do that, they not have any ability to do that. Don't you agree, Jen?
Oh, okay. Surely if someone were willing to post a comical status or tweet on Twitter about the fact that they were about to commit this crime, it's not going to take away from the fact that they could still go out and rob a shop. It's not going to take away from the fact that they could go
well,
to
yes, but there are a whole class of people who wouldn't necessarily commit crimes themselves, who might nonetheless want to try and encourage others to do it, right? And even if they're going to commit that crime, we're happy to try and put as many barriers to them committing that crime as possible so that less people do it, right? So less people are harmed by that crime, less people actually commit that crime and then are involved in the criminal justice system. We're just happy to try and discourage people from commission of crimes. We're quite okay with that. Right. So why is it important to remove a climate of fear, right? So when we say ordinary law-abiding citizens like David Starkey are exposed to, right, violent language that glorifies attacks on the police, that glorifies attacks on shopkeepers, right, that frequently is racially or religiously incendiary, right, that demonises classes of people, we think that does create a climate of fear for those individuals who live in that city, right? We are happy to do everything possible to protect those people from that situation so that ordinary people are not intimidated, so they are not vilified, so they don't feel like they can go about living their lives. Because we don't feel that Twitter is so tremendously important to society that people can't survive without it. People get by quite fine when the server goes down for 24 hours, right? We think that people can live without Twitter, they can live without other social media, because to be clear, insofar as any other social media is used to do this, we would also shut this down. We don't claim that this will ever be 100% effective. We're merely claiming that we'll discourage some crimes. We're happy to use this in other forms, but this is also necessary, right? We think it's more important to protect those law-abiding individuals who have done nothing wrong, right, who have no reason to have their lives infringed from people who seek to intimidate them, who seek to harm them. So fundamentally this debate is about comparing whether it's better to allow people to openly glorify riots, to celebrate and indulge in riot, to encourage others to engage in rioting, to give information which makes it easier for people to riot, to, for example, tell people where the police are, where cordons are, to identify shops that have been broken into or that don't have security, right? Whether those people's rights to free speech is more important than the people they harm, right? We say that we are thoroughly happy to infringe on the rights of criminals, to celebrate their criminality, as long as that protects hardworking individuals. We beg to propose.
So what we want to do in this speech, ladies and gentlemen, is look at two things. I want to look at why this doesn't actually make violent riots that they're actually scared of less likely to occur. And more than this, it criminalises and damages the ability for people to make legitimate political protests in situations where Western liberal democracies have failed. Their contention is that this never occurs. We say it occurs quite frequently. We point to Rodney King, where the black urban community within LA had no legitimate means of protest to say, look, the police were being racist in this situation. We point to the student loan situation, where people were excluded from the political process by virtue of their age, ladies and gentlemen. We say at the point at which you are being excluded from every other avenue of political discourse, sometimes violence is the only way you can get your message heard on a massive sphere. And what they do is they stop this, ladies and gentlemen. So, first point. Let's have a look at this idea that Tito brings us of critical mass. His contention that Twitter makes this point of critical mass more likely, and that more people, because they see people are already out there rioting for steak slices, it makes you more likely to go out and want a steak slice as well and just take it. The problem is Oscar's already conceded that there is the existence of this thing called the media, ladies and gentlemen, and this is probably riot going to be on the media, and people are going to be able to say, hey, he's already taken that steak slice. We don't think Twitter has much involvement in the creation of this concept of critical mass that they want to rest their stuff on, ladies and gentlemen. Then we have other responses to this. Our second response is, right, so you ban Twitter. People probably use Quitter or Switter or create numerous other Twitter alternatives in the same way like Facebook has created numerous other Facebook alternatives within China where they put a legitimate ban on the use of Facebook within China, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, we say there are still other ways to organise your riots. We say you're still able to get out there on email. You're still able to get out there in text, ladies and gentlemen. What it does is it actually removes from the public view where the places of these riots are going to happen, ladies and gentlemen. We say it's harder to monitor both from a media and public perspective and also from a police perspective, ladies and gentlemen. What we say the police can do when they look at the riots that occurred in 2010, 2011 in the UK, ladies and gentlemen, they're able to go on Twitter, and when the first lot of Tottenham riots happened, they were able to issue police warnings to people in Croydon saying similar things were likely to happen there. Similar things were likely to happen in Camden. So what happened was people were likely to stay at home. So Oscar's problem is, right, but all of this creates a climate of fear. Twitter existing creates a climate of fear. we're going to say it's probably not Twitter that is creating a climate of fear. And at the point at which you ban Twitter, you're actually going to make people more scared because you're less able to identify the things that are actually going to be actively harming you. So if you're an individual who is living in Croydon and you think it might occur, we think it's much better for you if the police were to say it's definitely going to occur, either move out or stay at home, and they're able to place their policing in the areas in which the rioting is more likely to occur, because we say that's what Twitter enables you to do, than if you ban it altogether. So in terms of long-term consequences, which is something they've also not really engaged with, is this idea of we don't really think riots are going to bring down the state. But what we do think they do is they offer some form of threat to people involved. And more than that, we see what happens with riots is you don't just have one riot, you have 2, 3, 4, 5 riots. What Twitter enables you to do is identify who's the key target and the ringleader, and either engage with him in both in a criminal way and say, look, we're going to lock you up, and makes him much less able to rally troops behind him, or engage with him in a more legitimate way. So our fourth response to this is like response marches and the ability to create response marches. Because we say certain groups that commit violent marches, say the EDL, have the ability to organise themselves outside of the sphere of Twitter. But the problem is that UAF are much more globally based and they're less able to organise themselves in responses of Twitter, ladies and more need Twitter to engage and create the flash mobs that actually occur. Go ahead, Oscar.
Again, there's nothing that stops people from organising peacefully, right? They can quite happily, as you point out, use email. Right? Media can tell people to stay in their homes. This is about stopping people from conspiring in a criminal conspiracy.
No, it's not. It's about stopping people from having access from something that will probably do very little. But what it will do in terms of the long term is, especially in terms of, say, like the student loan protest that happened in Britain, which could have quite easily been defined as riots and have been defined as riots, causing an entire class of people now to be defined as criminals, ladies and gentlemen, because they have simply engaged with an online program and they have simply called themselves Twitter users. So we say what you do is you now define the middle classes who engage in the student loan protests as now potential criminals if you ever get involved in either Twitter or if you go on these marches, ladies and gentlemen. We say this makes it much more problematic. If you're trying to highlight areas where democracy has failed, if you're trying to be like response marches to the Rodney King race riots, if you're trying to point out the fact that the student loan impacts are going to impact you disproportionately and you have no other way to actually get involved. Because we say the government is far more likely to see this as a violent protest because it's an attack on the government's identity. And wait, sorry, is that... I'm coming up to time. Okay, I'll wrap up. Because we say the government's always going to see any form of protest that attacks something that it's doing as a form of violent protest. Because it's not only an attack on the government's identity, but it's an attack on its political identity and the way it appeals to a mass market. And it's much easier to define a protest as something as violent and illegitimate than actually engage with the root causes. With that, ladies and gentlemen, I beg you to oppose this motion.